Jessica, it's awesome to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I was curious learning about your upbringing, that you grew up in a quote, quiet culture household. Can you describe what a quiet culture household was?
This is the premise of my upcoming book, Smart Not Loud. And it's essentially why I wrote this book because, to understand a quiet culture, I have to share a bit about my story. And this is exactly kind of your question, how I was raised. So I would consider myself raised in a pretty conservative, traditional, and for me, I'm Asian home. And it's not uncommon for folks like us to be taught certain principles. And I will say, this definitely translates beyond just an Asian home. For some of us, we were raised to be extremely hardworking, but very modest. You tend to listen more than speak. You don't cause waves. And for the most part, if something good happens to you, you generally keep it to yourself. So these are what I called quiet culture traits. And in many ways, these are very valued in our culture and in our household too. And the whole premise of the book though is like, even though this is very much a part of us, a part of me, when we start working in a fast-paced corporate world, you suddenly realize that it actually takes a whole different set of traits to get noticed and build visibility. Thus, a lot of the communications friction starts to happen. So, and we can get into that later on.
So how did your upbringing help you and or hurt you when you got into your career?
It's interesting because I feel like when I first started out, I went in, and I think for many of us, when we first graduate college, we're excited to start working, right? We know about the concepts of like, okay, be a good team player, work hard, hit deadlines, all the basic stuff. And that was me. I was ready. And for me, I started my career as a journalist. I started working. My first job was at the NBC station in Reno, Nevada. And as you can imagine, I'm going into what I would consider a very like extroverted industry where, if you can imagine, a lot of the journalists, the people on television are very charismatic, very good at communicating, very good at speaking up in meetings. But for me, I felt like I simply wasn't taught the communication skills needed to pitch my idea, chime in meetings. Like I would often find myself sitting in these meetings, and again, this is when I was like 20, 21 years old, and I'm like, what do I say? How do I say it without feeling like I'm talking over people? Or here's another example, in a quiet culture, we learn that deference to authority is very important. So basically, anyone who's more senior than you, anyone who's more experienced than you, typically you associate them with, just you listen to what they have to say. And I remember early on, I would see, colleagues my age challenging my manager. And I'm like, oh my God, like, how do they have the confidence to do that? So in many ways, like, did it help? Did it hurt? I always say, the values we were raised with, for example, for me, quiet culture, they're very much a part of me. They're still very much a part of me. It's values that I want to, pass down to my kids as well. But then the whole idea with Smart Not Loud is teaching the other skills that's needed without losing a part of yourself in the process.
Okay, let's get into those skills. What are a few of those skills needed to be effective, especially when you're getting into a newer job, or maybe even you've been promoted to a new management role, and now you have a whole nother set of senior leaders that are above you that can be even more intimidating, have a lot more experience than you, maybe be a lot older than you. That's what I'm curious about.
There's a whole chapter, and this is essentially part two of the book, where I start diving into what do you actually need to do in your career to essentially control your job. Because I think what happens to a lot of us is we'll start working and we're actually pretty good at what we do. Like we're smart, we're capable, but suddenly we get boxed into that role where, oh, Jessica, Ryan, oh, you're good at that. Like, why don't you just continue doing that project? But you yourself, and I think a lot of us have this sense of like, yeah, I'm okay doing it, but it's not what I want to continue doing. So there's a whole chapter, and this is what I start out with in part two, where the first thing you got to do is think about shaping your career brand. And this is one of my favorite chapters because it's a very proactive way of thinking about your career. And when I say shaping your career brand, sometimes people think, "Oh, you mean like personal brand?" Yes, but I like career brand. I think because we're talking about professional development, it's really thinking about when people hear your name, what comes to mind. And not only that, you are crystal clear on what you want to do and how can you find more opportunities to do it. Now, I'll share a very quick story about how I embody this too. So, very much this idea is you got to seek out opportunities for yourself because even though we may have things we're interested in, we can't expect people to hand it to us or even know we're interested in it. So, when I was a reporter, I was what we consider a general assignment reporter, meaning you just cover everything that comes into the newsroom, business stories, politics, the fire, the police chase, anything that's going on in the news that day. You're just typically assigned general assignment. But deep down, I've always been interested in business. I think, my father, he does business, my brother does business. We had this like entrepreneurial spirit in our family, and I love the idea of covering business stories. But I knew, if I had just pitched this idea to my boss, like, oh, can I just cover business stories? He'd say, I'm glad you're interested, but you still got to do your work, which is there's a lot of other things you have to finish the projects, right? So for me, I was number one, very consistent in constantly strategically pitching business stories so he could see that this was genuinely something I was curious in. But then the real change happened when I pitched this idea of a business show. And not only did I say I wanted to do it, I said I would do it in addition to the work that I was already doing. So, in many ways, he was getting kind of like a win win. I was willing to do quote unquote double the work, but I was fine and I was happy with it because I was still getting the work that I needed to do done, but I was still fostering this sense of curiosity that I had, which was to build a business show. So, this story just kind of shows that, we got to ask for what we want. We got to be proactive. We got to continuously follow up. But at the end of the day, you got to do it. You can't expect people to do it for you. So this is shaping your career brand so people constantly can remember you for what it is you want to be known for.
Hmm. So you were willing to say, I'll do more. I'll do my job and I'll do it well. But in addition to that, I'm going to do this. What about for those who say, oh, Jessica, especially if they're a little later and maybe they have kids and they have a big life outside of work, because it sounds like you were younger earlier in your career. I don't know if I want to double my workload. That sounds like maybe not feasible, or something in my life might suffer, either personal life or my regular day job might suffer. What do you think about that when saying, I'm just going to do extra, I'm just going to do more?
It's true, right? Because all of us only have X amount of time every day. But I really think that if this is something you care about, and it's not about pitching something grand, like, when I first pitched that idea, I wasn't literally doing double the work. It was probably like at the time, 10 to 15% of it. And here's the thing, once he saw that I was passionate about it and I could do a good job, then I essentially made a strong case for myself to then advocate to ask for more time. So before I knew it, he actually gave me what started out with maybe like 2 hours a week. Then it was like 4 hours a week. And then before I knew it, he gave me like an extra whole day in a week that this was like, okay, Jessica, this is your business show day. Go ahead and do whatever you want. But I think that's the thing. You got to earn it. And
Yeah.
here's the thing for those who are busy, because I get it. I'm a parent. I have kids too. It's like you don't have to start off grand. Just start off with that thing. But whatever that thing is, it's what you are passionate about, what you're interested in. And not only that, you want to do it. And I feel like, and I don't know, I might be biased, but I feel like anytime we're doing things that there's a reason for why we're doing it, that doesn't suck up energy, or at least not as much as doing work we're like not excited about.
You get excited. Yeah, you get excited about the thing and that brings more energy. Okay, love that. And I was digging into let's get really practical, okay? And I'll paint a picture, and then I want you to share some of the tools because I think you share a lot of tools in your book that could be helpful for people to implement immediately. Okay, you're in a meeting and you want to speak up effectively. You want to make a difference. You don't want to just have your voice heard just for the sake of saying, well, I haven't said anything in a while. I just need to speak up. So you want to actually make a difference. You want to help. You want to be a value add. And you have this 4A sequence. What is the 4A sequence you use to speak up in meetings?
This is a great technique, especially for the folks who tend to sit in meetings and you're like, oh God, I have a good idea, but how do I chime in? How do I say it so that people listen? But not only that, and this is especially really helpful for folks who tend to overthink. And that's definitely me, where I like am like, I know I want to say it, but then you start going into this dialogue of like, is it a good idea? Is it silly? Oh my God, people are going to judge me. Anyways, so the 4A sequence is a way of thinking about how to chime in. And it starts with number one, and this is the most easy one, it's just A for active listening. And the difference is the opposite of active listening is passive listening, where you're just listening to just kind of like listen, but you're not really intending to say something. And I think when we're in a meeting, it is absolutely critical that we at least say one thing. It doesn't have to be the most profound thing, but it's just letting people know that you're in the room, you're engaged, you're participating. And so the first one is active listening. And the reason why we active listen is because we find that moment. And this is the reason why it's important. You find that moment, that split second, pause, that thing that someone said that you're like, ooh, this is my chance because this is relevant to what I want to say. Okay. So then after you active listen, the next one is you acknowledge. So acknowledge is a way of chiming into a meeting where you're not like trying to dominate a meeting, talk over someone in a meeting, but you're letting the person who just spoke. So this is very tactile. You're letting the person who just spoke right before you heard them. So acknowledging is like, Ryan, that's a really interesting point you just made. It made me think of, or Ryan, that is acknowledging, like you're subtly letting the person who just spoke know that you heard, because oftentimes when people speak, they just want to know people heard them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
think acknowledging and verbally explicitly saying that's an interesting point, or it made me think of, right? That's acknowledging. Next is anchor. So this is the third A. Anchoring is taking one or two words the person just said and using it as a way to build off to what it is you want to say. So, Ryan, that's an interesting point. You mentioned the word podcast. It made me think of another podcast that I listen to that I think is fantastic, right? So, I'm taking a word, maybe you just said podcast, and then I'm building on it to tell you what I want to tell you. And then finally, the fourth one is answer. And answer is just kind of going to the point of like, okay, this is what I want you to know. This is the point I'm trying to make. And this is what I want to have you sink in. So this is a 4A sequence: active listening, acknowledge, anchor, and then answer basically means make your point.
Did this take you a lot of repetitions to get good at? And what I mean by good is so that it flowed naturally. Because anytime if you feel robotic or feel like you are using some sort of tool to the other person, it may feel like, is this like some sort of inauthentic psychology they're working on me to be able to, you know what I mean? Because when you think of it as a tool, I love it. I think it could be super helpful, but it has to feel real. It has to feel genuine. Have you got any feedback like that when you've taught others and you've shared with them this tool to use to speak up in meetings?
It's interesting because I feel like every time I've offered this as a tool, people are like, this is exactly what I needed to hear in order to feel like I know how to speak up. Because I
Uh,
typically work with people who don't say anything, or they say something and they're just like, oh, like I feel like I don't know how, right? So this is the how, like this is what I want you to do. And I feel like what is particularly powerful about it is it's not something you have to do at every single meeting, right? You
yeah.
do it when it feels right. But the reason why the 4A sequence even came to fruition is because as a journalist, this is what we did. This is what we used. When we are interviewing people every single day, we are taught strategies too of like, how do you get someone comfortable? How do you get them to listen to you? How do you get them to engage and open up to you? So very much the 4A sequence, and this is not what it was taught to me in this sequence. It's what I created myself, but it very much leveraged a lot of like the principles I learned as a journalist to now everyday folks who can use it in meetings.
Huh. Okay. I like that you talked about your actual voice and how this is important. And I think this is a critical part of it as well. And that there are 5 elements of voice that maybe this is not something that people consider, but you want to create, like, become the kind of communicator that like people genuinely want to listen to. So can you go deeper on the 5 elements of voice?
This is based off research by a speech pathologist. So I'm not a speech pathologist by trade, but I definitely read a lot about it because since I talk about communications, I think it's very important to understand. So tone of voice, oftentimes people think it's like, it's what you sound like. It's what you sound like, Ryan. It's what I sound like. But it's actually much more than that. Our voice is made up of what you said. It's five elements. So I'll go through the five, and then as I go through this, I would encourage folks to also think like, oh yeah, I can see how that is one of the elements and I use it every day. So the first one is essentially your pitch, the pitch of your voice. And we know it as it being a higher pitch or a lower pitch. And generally speaking, men tend to have lower pitches, women tend to have higher pitches. But what we all have is we all have a range. And the key is to use that range, right? Sometimes when we're excited, right, we'll speak in a higher pitch. And that's great because we're getting people excited. But if we're talking about something serious, we want to lower our pitch so people can sense the gravitas of it, right? The other one is intensity. So it's essentially how fast you're talking, or sorry, how loud you're talking. People who are mad, right? They talk in a very intense voice. But when people are sad or shy, their intensity seems to be on the softer side. But again, the key is variety. Sometimes the folks that I work with, they tend to be on the quieter and shy side. And so when they speak, people are like, wait, what? What did you say? Right. And so I always encourage folks, it's about having that variety when you speak. The other one is rate. So that's how fast you're speaking. When you're nervous, you speak fast, but at the same time, you don't want to speak so slow. I do a lot of presentation training, and I know when people get nervous, they talk fast. But at the same time, I don't always encourage them to talk slow unless it's strategic, unless you're driving a point home, because when you talk too slow, what's the problem? It's boring. It's like low energy, right? So again, variety. And the fourth one is what we call inflection. And that is essentially what words you want emphasized. So even as I say that sentence, right, I'm strategically putting inflections on certain words and even pausing for a millisecond behind it because I want you to know that this is an important like point that I'm trying to make. And the fourth one is basically the quality. It's just what you sound like. When someone calls you Ryan, you pick up the phone, they're like, oh yeah, this is Ryan. And it's basically when someone's voice is either raspy, squeaky, it's actually just inherent. It's like who you are. And of the five, we say the first four is what you can change. You can't really change the fifth one because it's you and it's what makes you unique. But when we talk about being a powerful and strategic communicator, we got to learn how to play with all four.
Another thing that I personally struggle with, and I think a lot of people do, is saying no. Okay. And a lot of us feel, especially working in a job, and maybe you're a mid level manager, and you feel honored when people, hey, will you do this? Will you do this? Will you do that? Will you do this? And you say, yeah, 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 yeah. And before you know it, you've said yes to a million things. Your calendar is stock full of meetings for a variety of projects. And all of a sudden, you become average to good at a lot of things instead of excellent at a few things. How do you say no with confidence without hurting your career?
And even your credibility, right?
Yes.
Because if you say no, people will be like, well, this person isn't a team player. And I
Yeah.
get it. it's hard, right? Because generally speaking, we want people to like us. We want people to see us as, someone who is willing to collaborate, be a team player, right? But the problem with saying no, I mean, saying yes to too many things is we take away time for us to do things that we want to do, the things that we care about, maybe the projects we're excited about, right? Because as we all know, we only have X amount of hours every single day. So it's funny because when I was even thinking about, all right, how can I teach folks to confidently say no? I acknowledge it's hard. As a huge people pleaser, right? And it's also kind of like, you want people to like you. It's like you want them to also feel like they can approach you. But like I said, it's important to do so. And so, in order for me to kind of get this concept home, I actually also have a framework in this book, and this framework is a way of saying no. So it's a way of framing your no that is better than just straight up and even awkwardly saying no, which can happen because it's uncomfortable for you and it's uncomfortable for them. And before it's just awkward all around. So this approach is called the EOT approach. And for me, I'm all about acronyms because that's how I remember things. That's how I can apply things. But I'll go through it really quickly. So when you want to say no because you realize that this isn't a good use of your time, or maybe you're actually not the right person for it, the E stands for explain. And this is just explain in a sentence or two. And that's the key. Don't be long-winded about it. Sometimes when we are awkward about situations, we can be long-winded. That was certainly me. You just want to explain in a sentence or two why you cannot. I cannot do this because I currently have so much on my plate that I have to finish before, I don't know, in 2 weeks, right? Or I'm not the best person for this because this is actually not something that I think I can offer or be the best person to help you, right? Give and explain. That's E, explain. The O is now, and this is the key, offer options.
Hmm.
Instead of leaving people hanging and just being like, oh, sorry, now's not a good time, and just being like, that's it. You want to say, well, maybe if you check back with me in a few weeks, I might have more time. Or you can say, you know what? I'm not the best person for this, but I think you can talk to this person and they might have other ideas. Because if you think about it, right, people are coming to you for help because they need help, right? And as a good team player, which is still what you want to show that you're not leaving them hanging and you're still giving them other avenues to consider. And then the T of the EOT is tone. And I liked that we had just a few minutes ago talking about tone, but it's true. Tone is meaning you just be very neutral, matter of fact. And this is where I think people can then sense your certainty because depending on and I know sometimes we have folks on our team where they're like, well, come on, it's just a simple thing, right? But if they can tell with your tone that you're serious, right? Then they'll be like, okay, thank you for considering, or let me talk to this person. So EOT is a way of saying no that helps you structure it, I think, a little bit more, that can give you that confidence essentially.
So this was actually recently written about by Adam Grant, and maybe this doesn't apply in the corporate world like it does for somebody like him who is being asked to do stuff all the time. What he said was, and I don't know, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but he said when you turn down a request, you don't owe an explanation. Other people aren't entitled to know your reasons and priorities. Being courteous is not about justifying your decision. It's about showing gratitude for the invitation. He writes, quote, honored to be asked, sorry to decline. Do you think that's a little over the line, or maybe that's different? That could be for someone who's like a solo entrepreneur like him, who's getting asked to give speeches and go on podcasts and whatever else he's being asked for, and that wouldn't work that well. For example, corporate America.
So that example of Adam Grant is a great example because I mean, in our industry, we all know Adam Grant. I mean, he is being
Yep.
asked to do millions of things. And I think the way he is structuring his no is probably to people who might be external, right? Who might be
Yeah.
asking him to do things who he doesn't necessarily know personally. And I think the way I see it is when we are working with people who are literally in our company, on our
Yep.
team, or maybe like another division on our team, you can't just say, I politely decline. Like, to be honest, like, I honestly don't think that flies. And I
Yeah.
think you do. And so I will probably disagree with Adam. And I disagree in the sense of the context is different. I think
Yeah.
he probably is saying no to a lot of external things who people who he might not ever have to ever see or talk to. But these are
Right.
people we have to deal with every day. So I do think giving an explanation, but not being long-winded about it, just simply saying right now is not a good time or I'm not the right person. I think that is actually a better way to think about it.
That's a good point. There's just nuance there. Okay, so looking through your career, you're working with clients from some of the most impactful companies in the world: Google, LinkedIn, Medtronic, HP, and you're a global business communication training agency. So I'm just curious, when somebody like Google or LinkedIn brings you in to work with their people, their leaders, what are you helping them with? Like, what's that work like? What do they struggle with?
That's a big question because it's actually many different things. So, for example, right? Like one of the most popular trainings that I do, well, there's actually, there's a few, but I'll share some of them. So one of them is really helping people develop executive presence.
Oh,
And I get this request a lot, especially for folks. And the folks who reach out to me typically are in learning and development, HR, or even leaders of their specific team who they're like, can you help my team develop that executive presence? And executive presence means they know the folks on their team are so smart. Oftentimes, they're very technical, brilliant, but they just don't know how to communicate their work. And it does take a level of executive presence to get people to believe them, to hear them. So I would say that's one of them. The other one is just straight up presentation skills. This is one of my favorite ones because I love teaching presentations in the sense where I know it's really hard for people, but I feel like it was hard for me and I figured out a way to approach it a little bit differently. So typically when organizations, hey, can you come in and just like help my team, for example, just get better at giving presentations? That's something that we offer because as we know, and similar to executive presence, you can do good work, but ultimately, if you want people to know about it, you have to be able to present it and not even in this grand sort of way necessarily where you're standing in front of 5, 10, or even 50 people. It's just presenting your idea so people pay attention. Another one that I've been getting a lot of requests on is a topic on getting people to feel confident advocating for themselves. I have an entire chapter on advocating for yourself in the book, but this is one that I'm particularly interested in because I work with folks who usually are people of color. I work with a lot of women organizations too, who we all know advocating for yourself is important. But I think a lot of us, and this comes into the quiet culture now where we just weren't taught the skills to do it strategically and tactically. So yeah, when organizations reach out, it's typically around these topics of communications, and there's a lot. There's certainly no shortage of it.
so I'd love to dig into those. Let's start with the third one. How do you help someone who is uncomfortable advocating for themselves? What can they do this in a tactful way that doesn't look like boasting or bragging or look at me? What's the best ways for someone to advocate for themselves?
Advocating for yourself, the analogy I give is when you think about your family, when you think about your community, maybe organizations you're a part of, people on your team who you love, right? Advocating for folks that you care about comes really easy because you care about them. You want to support them. You want them to do well. And I think in order for people to get comfortable and confident advocating for themselves, they have to see advocating is a form of caring for themselves too. You advocate for yourself because you care about the
Mm.
work you're doing. You care about advancing. So, this was a huge mindset shift for me too, because similar to what you just said, I was like, well, if I just work hard, the promotions will come, right? If I just work hard, people will notice, right? That is not always the case, especially the higher up you go. Like you gotta ask for it. Hence the story that I did about that I shared earlier about the business show, right? I realized that I'm interested in it, but unless other people know, it's not going to happen. So there's a whole framework in the book, but I think the biggest kind of takeaway that I'd want folks to hear just right now is if you want to get people to hear you and eventually give you or grant you, what it is you're asking for, basically like your manager, right? Who has to generally approve it, you have to always think about, okay, how can I make a strong case for this? How can I eloquently explain to them how this is going to benefit the team? How is this going to benefit the organization? And I think oftentimes when we think about advocating for ourselves, we're like, well, I want to do it because I want to improve. I want to learn this, or I want to, do that. It's like about us, right? But I think if we want to build a strong case, we have to say in our request and early on in our request why this is going to benefit them and other people. And here's another thing about advocating for yourself. It's not just about asking once, too. I think sometimes we'll ask once, we'll be like, ooh, I'm proud of myself. I did it. I asked for it. But you got to circle back. You got to follow up. In fact, this is a very important like mindset. It's like you have to say it twice. And this is literally and figuratively. And I love this idea of say it twice, because when you make your request, you say it, you give your points of why it's a benefit to the team, and then you reiterate it. But saying it twice is also a way of thinking like, okay, I know I also got to follow up again, because I think sometimes we're like, again, we'll be like, I already said it, but wait, the default is I got to follow up. So
Yeah.
say it twice.
Got you. Okay. Now, leaders, my dad told me this right when I first got into getting a real job after I got done playing sports in college, which he said, hey, if you can develop the skills to get up in front of a group of people and give a 1 minute, 5 minute, 30-minute, 60-minute talk, it will send your career to the stratosphere. That's the quickest way to do it. Obviously, you got to do good work. That's table stakes. But to be an effective communicator in front of a group of people will really set you apart. So you help people with this. Presentation skills, speaking in meetings, town halls, I'm sure, right? All that stuff. And this could be a whole day class, I'm sure, or multi-day class on presentation skills. What are some of the keys to becoming a more effective communicator when you're giving a presentation?
I have to share one of the most formative and honest, and I still refer to this. I had a mentor when I first started out as a journalist, because like many of us, the thought of at the time, it was like, standing in front of a camera and talking about the news live, right? It was both exciting but terrifying to me, but I knew I had to overcome it. And I think similarly with presentations, it's the same thing. You're in front of a big group and you gotta present, right? And the tip that he shared with me that I thought was very important, this is what I share with all my clients, is when you are standing there, let's say on stage or in front of a room in a meeting, or even on Zoom, if you're doing a Zoom presentation, right? Do not see this as a presentation to X group of people or even the people based on their titles. I want you to see what you're about to do as you just having a conversation with every single person there. It is a conversation. That's what it is. And you're just telling folks what it is you want to tell them. And I remember when my mentor said that to me, it was a huge aha moment, because I think a lot of us get nervous, anxious because of the pressure of wanting to make that impression, wanting to say the right thing. And when we don't, we start to fumble. But I think when we see it as, hey, I'm just chatting with Ryan. I'm just chatting with Jennifer. And I'm just sharing with them like what's been going on with my work. When you start to see it as a conversation, it takes a lot of that pressure away. And honestly, it actually becomes more enjoyable because, again, a lot of the anxiety is the pressure we put on ourselves.
I like that. Because if you think about just when you talk to a friend, you don't struggle. You just have a conversation. It's probably enjoyable. It can be funny at times. And it's probably takes reps, and it's a little challenging to feel that way once you're on a stage or you're presenting to a group at work. But the more comfortable you can get in that setting, making it more conversational, the more at ease and enjoyable it will be for the people who are watching, who are in the room, who are paying attention. And even making it conversational, I found, Jessica, it's funny with giving speeches. I thought, okay, well, this one has 500 people. I can't make it conversational. I just got to go up there and just rip it, right? Just give the keynote. I've changed. I've evolved on that. I'm like, why can't it be conversational? I have 3 or 4 people now walking around with microphones, go stand in the crowd, make it more interactive, get the audience going. And since that evolution, it just feels like we're more connected. It's a better talk. It's more conversational. It's less like, listen to me, I'm so brilliant. No, you're not, dude. Like, just have a conversation with them and actually have them converse too. It could feel a lot better. So I found that like active participation with the audience to make any talk, keynote, presentation a lot better. Okay, the one more I want to hit though is executive presence, because some people hear that and, what does that mean? What do you mean executive presence? I'm not charismatic. I don't know. Can I develop that? So when you say executive presence, how can somebody who maybe doesn't have that self-described executive presence, how can they get more of it?
Let me begin with the misconceptions about developing executive presence. And the first one is executive presence is not only for executives.
Okay.
It's not only for folks who have whatever X fancy title or X number of years worked. I think executive presence is something anybody at any level, junior or not, they can develop, because it's this sense of, and this is how I define executive presence, it's that sense of inner confidence of knowing your stuff, but
Mhm.
also then being able to present it, communicate it, right? So it's basically, I see it as two parts. So what I love about talking about executive presence is I actually encourage, and so we work with a lot of younger folks too, like even folks who are in just starting off in their career and who are, of course, understandably very intimidated when they start working in a corporate environment, for example, where I'm like, actually, you need to start thinking about developing your executive presence, because my argument is when you have that executive presence, that is how people start to then see you as leadership material, right? It's not the other way around. It's not that you are first a leader, therefore you have executive presence. It's
Yeah.
being able to carry yourself in a way where when people see you, they hear your name, certain great words, positive words pop up. So then what does this mean? Like, how do you develop it, right? We say like executive presence, it's a few things. It's, of course, it's your communication skills. It would be very hard pressed for somebody to have executive presence if their communications is littered with filler words, right? So you got to get that under control, which is communicating well, succinctly, clearly, getting your point across, not talking in circles, right? But the other thing is, how do you make people feel when when they're engaging with you, right? Do they feel like you're listening, you're present, that you care? Right. I think this is a huge part of executive presence. And this is in many ways like the character of a person. And I think someone who has executive presence, people are attracted to them.
Yeah.
And I think that is something emotional intelligence, that's something that we can all work on and improve. So I think when somebody's thinking about executive presence, it's really thinking about communications, which is what I'm passionate about, but also like when people are engaging with you, how can you make them feel heard? How can you make them feel valued, acknowledging them, making them feel heard, helping them, right? I think all of this goes into it.
It's so interesting you say that. I just had a meeting with somebody who asked to kind of do the pick your brain thing, which is fine. I'll do those every once in a while. And I found that they were a terrible listener, which shocked me. I asked a bunch of questions. They kind of shared all their stuff. And then, oh, tell me about you, all this stuff. I'm like, well, you asked me out there. But anyway, so I started talking and they immediately started just kind of like looking around the room and looking around at the restaurant and all this. And I thought, this is not a fun experience. And I thought that was the opposite of making me like showing me that you cared or that you're interested. And so I don't know, like this one, I don't think is that hard, just to be genuinely interested in a person and then their story and learning about them and providing proper eye contact and showing that you're there. But it seems like, I don't know. I found that this to be a mixed bag when I'm out in the real world of people who have this, because executive presence is almost like just showing that you care, like showing that you're engaged, you're actively listening, but maybe it's not as normal as I wish it was.
Yeah, you would think it's like common knowledge, like, of course, right? But I
Yeah.
think you just said it, like you experienced it in real life not too long ago, and you're like, yo, like, what's going on? Like, I'm here. Like,
Yeah.
hello, right?
Yeah. Isn't that weird? I don't know. I don't know. Okay. I got one more that, given your career and the fact that you've done multiple things and now you've written a great book and you're helping, like I said, the leaders at some of the most impactful companies in the world. When you meet with somebody who maybe is a bit earlier in their career, okay, college grad-ish, maybe they're out in the working world for a year or two, they're not really sure exactly yet what they want to do, but they do want to leave a positive dent on the world. They want to do good. They want to help people. They want to be impactful. What are some general pieces of life/career advice you give to that person?
Well, I think there's so many, but I think, because communications is the work that I do, I think the advice I'm going to give is going to be around
Sure.
communications. So it goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is the importance, and this is especially for those who are on the younger, folks that you said are who are just starting out. It is really prioritizing learning the skill of advocating for yourself. And
Mm,
I know we touched upon advocating for yourself of like asking for what you want, circling back, but there are actually two other ones that we didn't talk about that I'll share right now too. Advocating for yourself also means being able to celebrate your wins. Don't just do good work and being like, yay, I'm proud, and tell your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your family, right? It's being able to know how to talk about it at work too. That's part of advocating for yourself. Why? So people know it. You cannot expect people to know this. And here's a very tangible tip. If somebody sends you an email and says, great job, or congratulations, maybe internally or externally, use that and maybe forward it to your direct manager and just be like, hey, check this out. That's all you have to say. And
yeah.
it's just these small, subtle, proactive ways of letting other people know that the work you're doing is being acknowledged by other people, right? That's an example. The other one that I want to say is, and we talked about this pretty extensively, but it's again also saying no, right? My EOT approach. This, in my mind, it's like a four-part framework of advocating for yourself, which is if you're early on in your career, not even early on in your career, and you want to think about accelerating it, making an impact, it is thinking about asking for what you want, being able to follow up and confidently follow up. And it is celebrating your wins and saying no. I think if you can remember these four things now and even 10, 15, 20 years in your career, you're going to be good.
So good. So good. The book's called Smart Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. Jessica, this was so, so cool. Where would you send viewers and listeners to learn more about you online?
Yes. So I'm most active on LinkedIn. That is my platform. I am on Instagram, so you can follow me there. But I think the bulk of my communications content, the tips I shared, are definitely on LinkedIn. So Jessica Chen page. But then, of course, a lot of stuff is on my website, Jessica Chen page. That's basically the website for everything, Jessica Chen page. Otherwise, my books website is smartnotloudbook.com.
Love it. Well, thank you again for doing this and for being here for and offering so much useful knowledge. And I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress.
I would love that. Thanks so much, Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica.